The Toronto Maple Leafs organization faces a critical juncture, with increasing calls for them to transition into deadline sellers, following a significant and concerning performance decline. This shift in sentiment impacts general manager Brad Treliving, coach Craig Berube, and the entire fan base. The urgency stems from a recent 5-game homestand, spanning from late December 2023 to early January 2024, where the team failed to secure a single victory. This period of underperformance has primarily affected the NHL landscape and its passionate Canadian following, driven by the team's poor defensive showings and subsequently dwindling playoff probabilities, necessitating a fundamental strategic reevaluation. Prior to their recent struggles, the Maple Leafs had already undergone a coaching change, an early indicator of underlying issues that surfaced earlier in the season. Following this change, the team experienced a deceptive 7-0-2 run, primarily against non-playoff contenders. This streak, while seemingly positive, inadvertently created a false sense of hope and masked deeper structural problems within the roster and system. The subsequent Tower of Terror freefall, as it has been colloquially termed, began with an unprecedented winless 5-game homestand. This marked the first such occurrence in over 40 years for the franchise, dating back to a period between December 29, 1984, and January 9, 1985. During this abysmal stretch, the Maple Leafs were outscored 25-12, effectively cementing their status as, based on recent performance metrics, the worst defensive team in the entire NHL. Detailed SportLogic data supports this assessment, highlighting severe deficiencies across numerous defensive categories. The core issue appears to be a combination of a lack of will, not skill, among some players, and a clear talent deficit on the defensive end. This problem is exacerbated by uninspired play, where players often appear disengaged and lacking the necessary intensity to compete at an NHL level. The initial optimism for a mid-season playoff surge has now entirely dissipated, replaced by a widespread internal and public debate centered on the necessity of selling now and retooling the roster. A full rebuild is not considered a viable option due to the presence of established good players like Auston Matthews, William Nylander, and Matthew Knies, whose long-term commitments make a complete dismantling impractical. Current analytical models estimate the Maple Leafs' playoff chances to be alarmingly low, ranging between 5 and 18%. Even if the team were to miraculously secure a playoff berth, the consensus suggests this would be an undesirable outcome, likely resulting in another early exit, perhaps against a team like the Tampa Bay Lightning. Such a scenario would only see pending unrestricted free agents depart, without the organization having recouped any significant assets for their contributions. Therefore, the focus has shifted firmly towards a retool, aiming to maintain the core talent while strategically improving the surrounding roster. Examples of successful retools are often cited, such as the Boston Bruins' quick turnaround, ironically propelled in part by assets acquired from the Maple Leafs. The Washington Capitals also demonstrated a successful short-term retool, while the New York Islanders executed a hard pivot to reshape their identity. These examples provide a blueprint for what the Leafs might attempt to achieve. Long-term implications also loom large, particularly regarding the future of Captain Auston Matthews. Continued struggles could naturally lead to questions about his long-term commitment to the franchise, especially as his contract progresses. It becomes imperative for the team to recoup assets from current players who are not part of the long-term vision to fund future improvements and address existing roster imbalances. This brings General Manager Brad Treliving under intense scrutiny. Questions abound regarding his capacity to execute the necessary hard pivot required to navigate this challenging period. His previous tenure with the Calgary Flames, where he oversaw significant roster changes, influences public perception of his ability to manage such a transition effectively. Criticisms have emerged concerning past acquisition decisions, with some analysts questioning moves such as replacing Mitch Marner with players like Maselli, Joshua, or Roy, hypothetically speaking. Defenders of management might argue that the team won the Atlantic Division with 108 points last year, and that injuries to key players like Chris Tanev, Nylander, and Matthews have significantly hampered performance. Additionally, underperforming goaltending has been cited as a contributing factor. However, counter-arguments suggest that last year's success was potentially a percentages-driven fluke, characterized by unsustainably high save and shooting percentages. The underlying numbers, even in that successful season, were not particularly strong, indicating a consistent lack of puck possession and structural defensive issues that have now become more pronounced. Coaching scrutiny also falls heavily on Craig Berube. The current defensive statistics directly reflect on the impact of his coaching system. A pervasive lack of defensive structure is evident, coupled with persistent issues on special teams, excluding the penalty kill, which has shown some resilience. The prevailing sentiment is that the current system does not adequately fit the roster, and there are reports suggesting that players are not fully bought in to Berube's methodology. Examples of underutilized defensive-minded players, such as Scott Lawton or Nick Roy, if they were on the roster, highlight a potential disconnect between player capabilities and system implementation. It appears players are prioritizing offense over defensive assignments, even when defensive personnel changes are made, leading to consistent breakdowns. The Tower of Terror freefall has definitively introduced a new and stark reality for the Toronto Maple Leafs. The critical question now revolves around who gets to do something about it, and more importantly, whether the current leadership structure possesses the capability and strategic vision to execute the necessary and difficult changes. The pre-Christmas period offered a fleeting moment of deceptive stability. Following the dismissal of their previous coach, the team embarked on a 7-0-2 run. This streak, however, was predominantly achieved against non-playoff contenders, creating a false sense of hope and momentarily masking deeper systemic issues. This ephemeral success quickly evaporated, giving way to the recent and stark decline. The subsequent winless 5-game homestand was a historical anomaly, the first such occurrence in over 40 years, dating back to a period between December 29, 1984, and January 9, 1985. During this abysmal stretch, the team was outscored 25-12, a differential that unambiguously illustrates their defensive collapse. This period solidified their reputation as the worst defensive team in the NHL by recent performance metrics, a label supported by the aforementioned SportLogic data. The defensive metrics provided by SportLogic are particularly damning. The team consistently ranks at or near the bottom in categories such as slot shots allowed, high danger chances against, and controlled zone exits. This data confirms that the problem is not isolated to one or two players, but is systemic, involving multiple defensive pairings and forwards failing to consistently backcheck or cover their assignments. The issue is not merely a lack of individual defensive skill, but also a noticeable absence of willingness to engage in the gritty, disciplined defensive play required at the NHL level. This uninspired play has created a cycle where defensive breakdowns lead to high-quality scoring chances for opponents, further eroding confidence and exacerbating the problem. The shift in public and internal debate from playoff optimism to contemplating a cellar status is significant. Initially, there was hope that the team could rally and secure a playoff spot, building on the perceived strength of their core offensive talent. However, the recent performance has rendered such aspirations unrealistic. The current discussion centers on the necessity of selling now at the trade deadline to retool the team. The consensus avoids a full rebuild, acknowledging the presence of exceptional talent in Austin Matthews, William Nylander, and Matthew Knies. These players represent foundational pieces that the organization cannot afford to move, necessitating a more targeted approach to roster construction. The abysmal playoff chances, estimated between 5 and 18%, underscore the urgency of the situation. Even if the team were to scrape into the playoffs, the scenario of a quick elimination, potentially at the hands of a familiar foe like the Tampa Bay Lightning, would be counterproductive. It would mean that pending unrestricted free agents would leave the organization without the team having acquired any assets in return, representing a missed opportunity to replenish the prospect pool or acquire future draft capital. The retool strategy, therefore, becomes the most logical path forward. The immediate impact of this stark reality dictates a necessary pivot. The team must transition from playoff contender aspirations to becoming assertive sellers at the upcoming trade deadline. This strategic shift necessitates evaluating the roster for players who can fetch valuable assets, rather than retaining them for a potentially futile playoff push. Potential trade candidates include Bobby McMahon, whose recent performance could attract interest, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, despite his inconsistent play, and Max Domi, who could offer depth to a contending team. Even Matias Maccelli, a younger asset, might be considered if the return is substantial. The most significant, albeit controversial trade possibility involves Morgan Riley. While a long-serving Maple Leaf, his contract and performance could yield a significant package of prospects or draft picks, accelerating the retooling process. The overarching goal is to acquire assets, draft picks, promising prospects, or young, cost-controlled players that can contribute to future improvement and provide a more sustainable foundation for the team. This approach is not about dismantling the core, but about intelligently augmenting it. Leadership now faces its most critical test. General Manager Brad Treliving must demonstrate his capacity to execute a strategic and effective selling process. This requires not only identifying trade partners, but also negotiating favorable terms that maximize the return for departing players. His ability to navigate previous complex situations with the Calgary Flames will be scrutinized, as the Leafs fan base demands a clear and decisive direction. Simultaneously, coach Craig Berube must adapt his approach. His role shifts from tactical game preparation for a playoff-bound team to evaluating talent and implementing a system that maximizes the potential of a reconfigured roster. This involves fostering development among younger players acquired in trades and instilling a disciplined, defensive structure that has been conspicuously absent. The system must fit the available personnel, not the other way around, demanding flexibility and a clear vision for the team's identity moving forward. For the fanbase, the scary part of the drop from perceived contender to undeniable seller is now psychologically complete. The uncertainty of whether the team would commit to a definitive direction has been replaced by the clear, albeit painful realization that significant changes are imminent. The focus now shifts from immediate playoff success to the long-term project of finding the next great one, a combination of management, coaching, and player personnel that can finally deliver sustained success. This involves a sustained effort to identify and integrate talent that complements the existing core. While a minor consideration, avoiding a high draft pick for the Boston Bruins, due to a top 5 protected pick from a previous trade, remains a small but present factor in any future asset management. More broadly, the organization must engage in these hard conversations about leadership and direction, both internally within the management structure and externally with the passionate fan base. This period demands transparency, accountability, and a clear articulation of the path forward. The team must demonstrate that this retooling is not a surrender, but a strategic recalibration designed to build a legitimate, long-term contender, moving past the cycles of underperformance and false hope that have characterized recent seasons. The goal is to emerge from this necessary transitional phase stronger, more balanced, and ultimately, more successful.